All right, get ready, because today we are diving deep into the world of negotiation. We're talking everything from hostage negotiation tactics to, the psychology of getting what you want. Looks like someone is ready to become a master persuader.
It's amazing. What I find so fascinating about these sources you sent is how they highlight that the same tactics used in these high-pressure situations, like negotiating with a hostage taker, these can actually help us in everyday situations.
Okay, that's already blowing my mind a little bit. One thing that I thought was so interesting was this idea of the power of no. I always thought saying no was game over in a negotiation. But it's more to it than that, right?
Absolutely. It's not about just shutting down the conversation. It's about using no strategically to actually empower the other person and almost guide them toward the yes.
Okay, so it's kind of reverse psychology almost. Can you give me an example of how that works in the real world?
Yeah, totally. So think of it this way. Imagine you're trying to convince a toddler to eat their vegetables.
Ooh, been there.
Right. Instead of demanding they eat broccoli, you say, "Do you want broccoli or carrots?" It gives them a sense of control.
That's good. And I can see how that would apply in a business setting as well. Instead of just presenting one solution, you're giving them option A or option B, so they feel like they have a little bit more control in the outcome.
Exactly. And one of the sources you sent actually mentioned this crazy story about an FBI negotiator, Marty Evilsizer, and she actually used this power of no to save her own job.
Oh, wow. I think I remember reading that. What happened there?
So her boss, he was feeling threatened by her success, so he tried to get her removed from some prestigious selection board, right? And so instead of getting defensive, she basically turned the tables on him and said, "So you want me off this board?" She gave him the illusion of control, which forced him to own up to his decision, which would have exposed his own insecurities.
And he backed down.
Yeah. He just completely folded.
Oh.
He couldn't admit to his true motives, so he had to just let her stay on the board.
Wow. Okay, I'm going to have to rethink how I use the word no from now on.
Yeah.
But I think one thing I thought was really interesting when I was reading about all this negotiation stuff, especially in these really high-stakes situations, like hostage negotiation, was the role of empathy. Which seems kind of counterintuitive, right? To try to empathize with someone who's taken a hostage. But it's often, the thing that leads to the peaceful resolution.
Yeah, it's called tactical empathy. It's not about, feeling sorry for the other person, but it's about understanding their perspective and their motivations to de-escalate the situation.
So you can't disarm someone if you don't understand why they're holding the weapon in the first place.
Exactly. One of the books you sent about hostage negotiation talks about a technique FBI negotiators use called labeling, which is basically acknowledging the other person's emotions out loud.
Oh, so instead of telling someone to calm down, which by the way never works.
Right, never tell someone to calm down, but you can say something like, "It sounds like you're feeling incredibly frustrated right now, and I want to understand why."
That's so much better. I mean, just hearing those words, just that phrase, "I want to understand why." That alone probably just takes the edge off a little bit.
Yeah, it just shows them that you're not just hearing their words, but you're hearing the emotion behind it, and you get it. And that creates a sense of, trust and rapport.
Yeah, that makes total sense. What about in a situation where, let's be honest, you kind of feel like the other side may already have some negative assumptions about you? Maybe they think you're going to be difficult, or they think you're going to try to take advantage of them. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's about addressing the elephant in the room. One of the sources you sent calls it an accusation audit.
Uh-oh, that sounds intense.
It sounds a lot more intense than it is, but it's actually super effective. It's basically just listing out aloud any negative assumptions the other side may have about you or your proposal.
So let's say you're a consultant, right? And you're about to give a proposal to a client, and they're going to be a little nervous about the cost. You can just feel it, right?
Oh yeah, you can feel them bracing themselves. Exactly. So instead of dancing around it, you could say something like, "I know you might be a bit concerned about the investment required for this project. You're probably wondering if it's really worth it. So let's talk about that."
Oh, wow. So you're not shying away from it. You're leaning into it.
Exactly. And it shows a level of self-awareness and transparency, which builds trust.
Yep.
Because you're acknowledging that worst-case scenario in their mind. You're taking away its power.
Okay. Accusation audit. Goes through the toolkit.
There you go.
All right, so moving on to another tactic that I thought was really interesting was these calibrated questions. And what I loved about this was how it empowers you to steer the conversation without being overbearing, right?
It's subtle influence. Like, instead of making statements or issuing demands, you're asking questions that will sort of nudge the other person toward the solution.
And you gave a great example earlier, like with the consultant who was having trouble getting paid by a client.
Yeah, so instead of sending an angry email demanding payment, she just asked, "How would you like me to proceed regarding the outstanding balance?" It just completely changes the dynamic.
Because then it's like they feel this sense of like responsibility. Like, oh, how would I like them to proceed? Okay, let me think about that.
Exactly, exactly. And it emphasizes starting with how or what question rather than why.
Right. So instead of why is this project always late, it's what are some things we can do to make sure it stays on track?
Exactly.
It's so much less, I don't know, it just feels less confrontational.
Way less accusatory, yeah.
Yeah. Gosh, I'm realizing how often I probably sabotage myself by using the wrong language.
It's a common trap, but once you're aware of it, it's like, okay. And this kind of ties into, this idea of bending reality, which is really just about understanding how our brains perceive value.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I loved the example of anchoring, which is basically like whatever that first number is that you throw out could totally change someone's perception of what's reasonable.
It sets the stage for the whole negotiation, yeah. The book gave this great example of someone offering you $20 to run a quick errand, and you'd probably be like, yeah, sure, easy money.
Right. Sounds good to me.
But what if you found out that this person, made $1 million because of that errand that you ran? Suddenly, that $20 seems like a total ripoff. The value of your time hasn't changed.
Yeah, but your perception of it has.
Exactly.
Wow. So it's really about setting that initial frame of reference.
It really is. And that's just one way to bend reality. Another one is pivoting to non-monetary terms.
Yes, this is where you get to be creative,
Yeah.
right? Thinking outside the box of just money.
Exactly. It's about understanding the other party's underlying needs and finding ways to meet them. Maybe they value recognition more than a couple of extra bucks, or access to a certain network.
So, for example, if I was negotiating a salary and we're kind of at an impasse, could I say something like, instead of a higher salary, I'd be really excited about leading that new project.
There you go.
That really aligns with my goals, and I think I could bring a lot of value to that.
Exactly. Now you're negotiating for something that addresses your needs, while potentially offering the company something valuable.
It's like a win-win.
Exactly.
It reminds me of that story, I think it was in one of the books, about this consultant who was training a hostage negotiation team. I think it was the UAE. And he was working with a really tight budget. He couldn't pay them their full rate.
Yeah, what did he do?
So instead of lowballing them, he offered them really prominent recognition in all of the training materials, press releases, all this stuff that would get their name out there.
Oh, so smart. He leveraged their desire for recognition and credibility in the field.
Exactly.
And it worked.
Yeah. So they were totally happy with that trade-off. It's like understanding those almost hidden motivations, right?
Totally, yeah.
Okay. So we've covered a lot. We've talked about the power of no, tactical empathy, calibrated questions, bending reality.
Yeah, we're getting there.
And then there were these black swans that you mentioned.
Right, those unexpected pieces of information that can totally change the game.
Right, but how do you even uncover those?
You have to dig a little deeper, ask the unconventional questions, look beyond the obvious.
It's funny, before this deep dive, I always thought that when it came to negotiation, more information was always better.
Yeah, that's a common misconception. But sometimes, less is more.
Oh, interesting.
In fact, sometimes the most powerful negotiation tool is knowing when to walk away.
So are you saying that sometimes the best tactic is no tactic at all?
Yeah, in a way, it's about recognizing that not every deal is a good deal, and having the confidence to walk away from the table if it's not serving your best interests. One of your sources even compared it to a hostage situation. Sometimes the best way to save the hostage is to refuse to negotiate, especially if the hostage taker's demands are unreasonable.
Right, because if you give in, then it's just going to encourage more bad behavior in the future.
Exactly. It sets a dangerous precedent. And that applies to everything from, business deals to personal relationships. You've got to have those boundaries.
Yeah, I love that. And speaking of boundaries, one of the sources mentioned this, 738-55% rule, and how it relates to communication, which just totally blew my mind. It's like saying that most of what we communicate doesn't even come from the words we're saying.
It's true. Only 7% of communication is the literal words that we use. 38% is tone of voice, and then 55% is body language.
Wow. So even if you have the best script, the best words, if you sound, insecure or your body language is all off, you're not going to get very far.
Especially in a negotiation, people can sense that, they're looking for those cues.
So it's not just what you say, it's how you say it. Any tips for how we can use that to our advantage?
Yeah, for sure. First, just being hyper aware of your own nonverbal cues. Like, are you making eye contact? How's your posture? Does your voice project confidence?
Yeah, it's so easy to forget about all that stuff when you're in the heat of the moment.
Totally. But it's something you can work on. And equally important, learning to read the other person's body language too. Are they leaning in? Are their arms crossed? What's their tone like? Are they mirroring your energy?
It's like you're reading between the lines almost.
Exactly. And those calibrated questions we talked about, those are super useful here too. If you're sensing that something is a little bit off, don't be afraid to just address it gently. Hey, I'm sensing a little hesitation here. Is there something about this that, we need to talk more about?
Yeah, just creating that open space for honesty, even if it's a little bit uncomfortable.
Totally. Now, this can all feel a little daunting when you're dealing with, those really hardcore negotiators, right? The ones who aren't afraid to play hardball.
Right. What about those people? Any tips for dealing with them?
Definitely. Remember how we talked about walking away? Sometimes that's the strongest move. Don't be afraid to call their bluff. And then there's the Ackerman model, which one of the books describes as the structured dance of concessions.
Okay, tell me more about this Ackerman model.
So you have your target price, right? Let's say it's $10,000. So instead of starting at $10,000, you start at 65% of that. So like $6,500. And then if they balk at that, you could go up to 85%, then 95%, and then if you absolutely have to 100%.
So you're kind of like you're making these smaller and smaller concessions. So it's almost like you're slowly giving in, but you're still in control of like the pace.
Exactly. And the key is to make each concession seem like it really hurts. Like, let out a sigh, do a dramatic pause,
Love it. It's all a game.
It is. But it's a game that, when played well, can really lead to great outcomes for everybody. One little pro tip from the Ackerman model is to end your concessions on an odd number. So like instead of $9,850, say $9,863, because it makes it seem like you calculated it down to the penny.
Wow, it's amazing how these like little psychological things can make such a big difference. This whole deep dive has really been eye-opening for me. I feel like it's not just about contracts and bottom lines. It's like really understanding, people.
Yeah, and I think when you approach a negotiation with that sense of curiosity and empathy and that genuine desire to find a solution that works for everyone, you might just be surprised by what you can achieve.
I love that. This was great. I feel like I have a whole new arsenal of negotiation tactics to try out.
There you go. That's what we like to hear.
Thanks so much for this deep dive. This was awesome.